Welcome again. This event is part of the C by C, so that's the letter C times C or XC. It stands for Council to Council. It's an ideas summit by World Affairs councils across the country. This week, the councils are going to highlight the power of our network. We are over 500,000 strong in the World Affairs Council system across the country, and there are lots and lots of neat events. So at the end, I will encourage you to go check out cxcamplified.com for the whole list of terrific events going on across the country. Let me take a minute to boost my own council. The Peoria Area World Affairs Council is the host of tonight's event, and I'd like to give a special shout out to Bradley University, who, if you all know me, or if you don't know me, this is my academic office here at Bradley, and I'm using their internet generously. So welcome. And tonight, let me introduce our speaker. Again, Ambassador William B. Taylor is Vice President, Strategic Stability and Security at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Last year, he served as Charge d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. During the Arab Spring, he oversaw U.S. assistance and support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. He served as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. And he has also served as the U.S. government's representative to the Middle East Quartet, which facilitated the Israeli disengagement from Gaza and parts of the West Bank. He served in Baghdad as the first director of the Iraq Reconstruction Management Office from 2004 to 2005. And in Kabul as coordinator of international and U.S. assistance to Afghanistan from 2002 to 2003. Ambassador Taylor was also coordinator of U.S. assistance to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. He earlier served on the staff of Senator Bill Bradley. He is a graduate of West Point and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. He is married with 2 adult children. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Taylor. Welcome, and please share your experience and knowledge with us.
So Angela, thank you very much. It's great to be back in Peoria. I actually wish I were in Peoria. I was there, as Angela and Don know, 2 years ago. I had a great visit out there. Remember with great fondness the conversations that we had out there, and so I wish I could be with you tonight, but I will be back. I look forward to coming back, and I look forward to this conversation. In particular, as I mentioned to Angela and Don just a minute ago, the questions from you are the most interesting part of this whole discussion for me. I'll try to say a little bit at the beginning, just to get the conversation started. But it's a great honor to be back with you and in Peoria. Since I was in Peoria 2 years ago, I'll just give you an update on Ukraine. I'll start off with a little update on what's going on in Ukraine. As Angela said, I was there last year for about 7 months. I was asked to go back to be the Charge d'Affaires, kind of the acting ambassador, from last summer until January of this year. It was an interesting time in Ukraine. It was a very interesting time in Ukraine. They had just completed a presidential election. And probably many people in this conversation know that the Ukrainians elected an actor, a businessman who produced and starred in a TV series, a Ukrainian TV series. The series is called Servant of the People, and the series is about a high school teacher of history who gets elected implausibly, but gets elected to be the president of Ukraine. And he gets elected because he is so focused on the problems of corruption and the problems of corrupt oligarchs. So that appealed to the Ukrainians, both in the TV series and then when he ran for president. He was elected overwhelmingly. He was elected with 73% of the vote. You can, anywhere in the world, when you get 73% of the vote in a presidential election is an indication that he had strong support. So President Vladimir Zelensky had just been elected president when I got back out to Ukraine last June. And there was a parliamentary election that he called because his party, by the same name as his TV series, Servant of the People. So the party is named Servant of the People, and the TV series is also. By the way, if any of you haven't taken a look at this TV show, it's available on Netflix. So just sign in on Netflix. It's called Servant of the People, and you will be able to see Vladimir Zelensky as the president. So that was going on. It was important for me to go back out to Ukraine. When I was asked, the State Department asked me to go back out. They had pulled back Ambassador Yovanovitch suddenly last spring, and they wanted somebody else to go out there for two reasons. One was to kind of reassure, settle, calm down the embassy, because the embassy had not been told, explained, they hadn't understood why their ambassador had been pulled out so quickly. So they needed some reassurance. And since I'd been there before, I'd been, as Angela said, I'd been the ambassador there in 2006, 2009. I knew a lot of the people, in particular the Ukrainians. And so I was able to go out there and have a calming effect, a reassuring effect, which is what Washington wanted to do. But the second reason was it was an important time in Ukraine's history. And anytime there's a change in government, a change in president, change in the parliament, it's a transition, as we know in our country. It's a transition in Ukraine. And it's important that the United States talk to the new people and talk to the president and talk to the prime minister and give a sense of what the United States stands for, is interested in, can help with, in the hopes that the government and the president will be interested in the kinds of things, the kinds of policies that we recommend. And of course, we recommend a strong democracy, independent Ukraine, and this is exactly what President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine wanted. So it was important to have a senior voice out there, and so I was able to go out there and serve. As many of you will know, last summer was a time when some unusual things happened out there. Part of what the United States does in Ukraine is support the Ukrainian military by training and weapons, training exercises, in that the Russians, as we all know, invaded Ukraine, annexed part of Ukraine, Crimea, in 2014, and have continued to fight Ukraine and conduct war operations against Ukraine in the southeastern part of the country, in a place called Donbass, parts of two of the provinces of Ukraine where the Russians and the Russian-led forces continue to cause problems and kill Ukrainians. There have been 14,000 Ukrainians who have died in Donbass at the hands of Russia and the Russian-led forces. So part of what we do, the United States does, is support the Ukrainian military in that fight. We also, of course, support the Ukrainian government's attempts to fight against corruption, which is a big problem. No one disputes that the corruption is a big problem in Ukraine, and we provide assistance to law enforcement and judicial systems and judges and training to help them fight against that as well. But the security assistance is a very important component of the overall U.S. assistance there because they're fighting an enemy that is hostile to not only Ukraine, but it's also hostile to Europe and it's hostile to the United States. So this is an important component of what we did. So last summer, there was a pause in this assistance to Ukraine, which no one could really understand. And that was a major problem for me, being out there, trying to convince the Ukrainians that we were a good ally and would continue to support them. We of course, the assistance eventually was put back on, turned back on. The pause was released, and we now continue with that kind of assistance. The negotiations to end that war continue. And my own view is the United States ought to be a little more robust, a little more active, a little more engaged in those negotiations to help the Ukrainians in their negotiations with the Russians to get the Russians out of their country, to get the Russians out of Donbass. But the Germans and the French and the Russians and Ukrainians have an ongoing series of conversations, negotiations in Minsk, in the capital of Belarus, which have been going on for now 6 years without success. My own view is that this is not a majority view, I will tell you, but I will go out on a limb here. My own view is that Mr. Putin and the Kremlin more generally would like to get out of Donbass. My sense is that the cost that he's figured out that the costs are higher than he thought and the benefits lower. He got great political benefits for annexing Crimea, and Crimea remains on the table. It remains an issue between them, but I'm going to focus, the negotiations have focused on Donbass. And my sense is Mr. Putin has figured out that Donbass is not worth it. Mr. Putin's under a lot of pressure right now, is why I think that this is becoming clearer to him. The pressure, obviously, of this pandemic that all countries in the world are facing and all governments in the world are facing. And it's a major crisis. It's a major crisis for us, major crisis for the Russians. It is getting worse and worse dramatically, in particular in the cities, in particular in Moscow. But the Russians are suffering greatly from this. So this is a big problem for Mr. Putin. That is leading, as it is here, to economic problems. And growth is negative. The Russians are looking at a recession, maybe a depression. We are looking at problems as well. We, of course, have more ability to deal with this kind of economic problem than other countries, in particular, like the Russians. So Mr. Putin is under some real pressure economically. The pandemic, as we all know, has reduced demand for oil. The supply continues to be high. The prices, therefore, are very low. And Mr. Putin and the Russian economy, more broadly, depends on high oil prices for the government, and in particular to fund overseas engagements. And Mr. Putin has several overseas engagements. Obviously, he's got the big one in Ukraine. He's also in Syria. He's also in Venezuela. He's got people in Libya. And people in the Central African Republic. So these are expensive operations, but the one in Ukraine is a big expense for him. And when oil prices are low, when the pandemic is facing him on a health crisis, and he's got an economic problem, my sense is he would like to do something to relieve the sanctions that we, the United States and Europeans and the West, have put on him for his invasion of Ukraine. And he could do that. And if he were to leave Donbass, if he were to withdraw his forces from Donbass, the West would pull back on the sanctions. Now, our Congress has a view about sanctions. They strongly support sanctions. But I believe if the Russians were to pull out of Donbass, that the Congress would go along with a reduction in sanctions. So just the last bit on the Ukrainian update. Just several days ago, about 3 days ago, the White House announced a new ambassador, the nomination of a new ambassador to go out to Ukraine. Once it's General Keith Dayton, by the way. General Dayton is a retired three-star general. I've known him for a long time. Angela mentioned I worked in Jerusalem with Palestinians and Israelis, and General Layton was out there. We met at that time. He is a real professional. He's nonpartisan. I believe he should be and can be and will be confirmed by the Senate, and that will allow the United States to do what I said earlier, and that is be a little more robust, a little more muscular in our support for the Ukrainians. I'm not talking about military forces. I'm talking about diplomatic support, economic support, security assistance, these kind of things. And I think having a confirmed ambassador out there will help. The person who's out there as a chargé right now was my deputy when I was out there last year, and she's great. Her name is Christina Kveen. She will stay on as the deputy chief of mission, as Ambassador Keith Dayton's deputy. So we'll have a very good team out there. So much for the Ukraine update. I've been very glad to take questions and listen to comments and get your ideas about this. Angela said that one of the things we want to talk about were lessons from Ukraine. And one of the lessons I've already mentioned, and that is, I believe that Ukraine is on the front line. It's on the front line of a lot of different battlefields. It's on the front line of the military battlefield that I've just described. The Russians have invaded, but it's also on the front line of the cyber battlefield. And the Russians start with cyber attacks on Ukraine, then they expand to Europe and they expand to the United States. Ukraine's also on the front line of the battle with the Russians in election interference. The Russians started their interfering in elections abroad, or at least in 2014, they interfered in the Ukrainian election. I was an observer at that time, and the Russians hacked into the Central Election Commission and almost had an effect on the outcome, or at least the announcement of the outcome. They were able to avoid it at the last minute, but that was the Russians in 2014 in Ukraine. The Russians didn't stop there. The Russians interfered in the referendum in Brexit in 2016. As we know, the Russians interfered in our election in 2016. And as we are hearing, our intelligence agencies are convinced that the Russians are already and will interfere in the 2020 election. So the point is, Ukraine's on the front line. Ukraine is where the Russians try things out. Military tactics, election interference tactics, cyber tactics, and then they use what they learned and they take it to Europe and they take it to the United States. There is a great book on this, by the way, written by a Yale professor, historian, Timothy Snyder. Some of you will have read several of his books. He's got a bunch of great books, but the one fairly recent one is called The Road to Unfreedom. And it's exactly what I just described. It's the road to unfreedom that starts in Russia, where they oppress their population, their citizens. They attack in various ways Ukraine and Europe, and they come to the United States. And that's the road to unfreedom. And that's the reason I think that Ukraine's important and why we should support it. Last lesson, and then Angela, I'm looking forward to questions. You said that there are some questions there, and I'm looking forward to those. The last lesson is that I learned last summer is the importance of what I call the regular channel of foreign policy making. There's the regular channel of U.S. foreign policy is made up of a whole range of agencies and a whole range of players. Of course, it's the State Department. Of course, it's the embassy, our embassy in Kyiv, who reports back to the State Department. There's an office, Ukraine office, and the State Department reports up to a deputy assistant secretary and assistant secretary, and on up to the National Security Council. That's the kind of the normal channel, but the normal channel also includes Congress, and it also includes the Defense Department, and it also includes USAID and the Justice Department. So this regular channel is the institution that forms and executes U.S. foreign policy. It's an institution that is built on trust. It sometimes is cumbersome, and sometimes unwieldy, and people on this call have probably, many of you have participated in this unwieldy institution called U.S. foreign policy making, but it's a conscience. It keeps us honest. It keeps us focused on what the U.S. interest is, and when the regular channel works, it eventually works, and it comes up with usually good foreign policy. I say that because last summer there emerged an irregular channel, and this irregular channel was off on a different mission, and it used some of the same people. There were some well-meaning diplomats who were part of this irregular channel that was outside of the regular channel. So, and that was a threat, frankly, to the working of the regular channel. So that institution and the institutional conscience of U.S. foreign policy, I think, is an important. That was an important lesson to me. That applies to other institutions as well. It applies to higher education. It applies to the church. It applies to the Congress. Institutions matter, and they have a way of working that keeps them honest and focused on their purpose and the foreign policy purpose. It's the U.S. national interest. So those are the two lessons. My conclusion, then the questions. Ukraine's important. It's on the front line. We should support it. We should develop and have a good team that's ready to do that. And Ukraine's success will be our success, because if Ukraine succeeds there, again, if the front line holds, then we are more secure. And that's what we're after. We're after a more secure United States. And Angela, with that, let me turn it to you for whatever questions people have.
Okay, I have a ton of them, and they keep coming, so that's good. But let me start with a couple. First, you had mentioned that Zelensky, with his 61% approval, or he was elected by 61% of the majority, that demonstrates that he was very popular. At the time he was elected, you expressed some hope that he was a younger, less baggage than the regular political folks. And so first part of the question is, does it demonstrate that he was popular, or that people were sick of the old baggage politicians? And do you think do you still have hope that his position as president is a positive one, especially in light of some of the changes he's making in his cabinet?
Very good question. Very good question. Yeah, you're right. In the parliamentary elections, he got over 60% of the seats. In the presidential election previously, in April, he got 73% of the votes. So yes, overwhelmingly popular. And I attribute a lot, not everything, but a lot to his campaign, which was consistent with his TV show, which was fighting corruption. And the Ukrainians, getting to your question about why, Ukrainians are tired of corruption, sick of corruption. They know it's a problem. And they believed him when he said he would focus on that. He had, the other reason that they voted for him, Angela, in response to your question, was his other top priority, which is ending the war in the East on Ukrainian terms. He wants to end the war. He wants the Russians to get out of Ukraine. He wants the Ukrainian lands, as he says, to come back to Ukraine's sovereignty. And he wants all of the Ukrainians who are being held still in Russia to come back. So the war and fighting corruption were the two things he ran on. And people, and the answer to your question is both. People believed he could do that. He was fresh. He is from the generation that did not grow up. He's kind of the first generation who grew up in the independent Ukraine. So when Ukraine left the failing Soviet Union, in 1991, he was 14. And so he had no professional experience, no adult experience with Soviet time. So he's a new generation. And people, Ukrainians, were hopeful that this new generation, and he is smart, and he's easy to like, he's very easy to like, and so 73% of the Ukrainians voted for him. Now, I did have hope, and I still have hope. However, I am concerned, as your question indicates, about the change, some of the changes in the cabinet that he's made recently. He's only been in office, he's only been elected for coming up on a year. His government has only been in office, 8 or 9 months, and he's already gone through a new prime minister, and he fired a couple of reformers, frankly. The head, kind of our attorney general, it's called the prosecutor general in Ukraine, was a very strong, competent, brave crime fighter and corruption fighter. And Zelensky didn't keep him, and he put a new person in. So I'm a little worried about some of those personnel changes. I do believe that President Zelensky intends to make Ukraine stronger and intends to fight those two things that he talked about, corruption and Mr. Putin. And he's looking for people that can help him do that. And he's kind of going through them quickly. And that's the trouble in any administration. But since he had no background in government, he's been working from what I call kind of a thin bench. He doesn't have many people standing in line ready to help him out on these kind of things. So it's a hard job. One other thing that we need to do then is help. I mean, that's another reason the United States is important for Ukraine to give this man some help. If he continues to go for reform, fight the corruption, defend Ukraine's sovereignty, as long as he does that, then we should help him.
Okay, very good. So one of the other comments you made about Ukraine's battle with Russia in their eastern provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk, there's still fighting that goes on regularly in spite of the ceasefires. And you noted that 14,000 Ukrainians have died. I don't know that we'll actually know how many Russians died because they're not officially fighting there. So, but to that point, you noted that if Russia were to withdraw its support perhaps and forces from Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbass region, that the United States would likely back off on the sanctions. But I think a major part of the sanctions was Crimea. And you know that Crimea has been, well, it was part of Russia since 1783 under Catherine the Great, but then after World War II, Khrushchev gifted it to Ukraine in 1954. And when the Soviet Union broke up, both Yeltsin and later Putin recognized Crimea as part of Ukraine until 2014, when it was invaded and they held an election and they have re-annexed it. Can you foresee, number one, the US Senate accepting that Crimea will never return to Ukraine, that it will now forever be Russia's, and reducing those sanctions? Or can you foresee some kind of situation where Crimea would return to Ukraine?
A great question. A great question, and a question that many Ukrainians think a lot about, including the president. I was in many meetings with him, both on my own and when visitors came to visit Ukraine, visit Kyiv, and talk to the president. It's fair to say in every conversation about the war, which means every visitor who was visiting Ukraine, every U.S. government person, would talk about Ukraine, talk about Crimea. So this is, and he would bring it up. President Zelensky would bring it up. So you're right. There are a set of sanctions on the Russians because they the first set of sanctions were because they annexed illegally Crimea. And so we have sanctions on investments into Crimea. We have sanctions on Russian officials who had anything to do with that operation. And so we have those sanctions that remain. Then when they invaded Donbass, we put an additional set of sanctions on them, on a broader set. The Russians, as you recall, shot down a civilian airliner over Donbass, and the Europeans piled on their sanctions at the same time. Then when they intervened, the Russians interfered in our 2016 election, we put on more sanctions. So my point is there's a layered set of sanctions on Russia for the various interference and attacks, really, aggression, on Ukraine and on Europe and on the United States. So Mr. Putin would like to get those sanctions off. It's very clear how he can get the sanctions off Donbass is that pull his troops out and stop supporting the Russian-led forces in Donbass, turn Donbass back over to Ukraine and turn the border back over to Ukrainian sovereignty. He can do that. Crimea is harder, as you indicated. But in answer to your question, no, the Senate won't accept it, the House won't accept it, the US government won't accept it. We will continue to argue that Crimea is Ukraine. Crimea is Ukrainian. In 1991, 1992, when the Soviet Union disappeared, imploded, everyone agreed that the borders, the internal borders of Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Russia and Belarus and Armenia would stay the same. That is, there would not be, and there were some skirmishes on some of those, but everyone, as you indicated, Angela, the Russians have ever since then agreed that Crimea is Ukrainian. And they have entered into treaties which were doing fine with the Ukrainians, saying that the Russians could use half of the naval port at Sevastopol. And they did, and they had a lease out until 2045, and they could probably have a longer lease if they wanted that too. There was no problem. Answer your question, no, we will never accept the Russian claim that Crimea is Russian. And we remember that there's another example of where we never acknowledged the Soviet annexation of the three Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Were annexed, illegally annexed by the Soviet Union in World War II, and we never recognized it. We never recognized it all the way through the 50s and 60s and 70s, 80s, all the way until, and finally, after the Soviet Union disappeared, the Baltic states are now free. And they're part of NATO, and they're part of the EU. And so Crimea might follow that same example. And until it does, until it's free, until it's part of Ukraine again, we won't recognize the Russian claim.
Okay, very good. That leads me to my next question. Do you see a path forward for Ukraine to join the European Union?
I do. In fact, is in the Ukrainian constitution now, they have included a provision that says the direction, the goal of Ukraine's international policy is to join the European Union. And by the way, to join NATO. So they are committed to that direction. Now, it goes both ways. So the Ukrainians are doing a lot to prepare to join the EU and NATO, by the way. But of course, the European Union has to agree. And the European Union is going through its own set of challenges at this point. I mean, they lost the Brits, and they've got, everybody's facing this coronavirus. So it's a difficult time for Europe. Nonetheless, in answer to your question, there is hope for Ukraine to join the European Union. It's already a member of the free trade agreement with the EU. It's already got visa-free travel with the EU. So it's taken a lot of steps in order to move forward on that integration process, and I think it'll continue.
Okay, very good. I just got a note that I'm supposed to tell you. I'm I'm asking questions from our audience, but I was kind of asking them the whole time. But thank you, Don. So, um, uh, so the real possibility of Ukraine joining the EU. What do you think about NATO?
I think it's a Ukrainian question. I think the question of military alliances, of economic alliances, of trade alliances are to be made by the people of that country, of any country. But in this case, Ukraine. I think Ukrainians will decide, should decide, or whether to apply to NATO. And if they do, then it'll be up to NATO to decide whether or not to accept Ukraine. While I was in Ukraine the first time in 2008, the NATO ministers and at a NATO summit of all the heads of state of NATO nations got together in Bucharest and thought about this question. While they didn't give the green light to Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO to begin the process, they did say, and Ukrainians remember this, the heads of state of NATO at a summit in 2008 said that Ukraine would someday be a member, and they remember that. So it's in the first instance up to the Ukrainians to decide, and the number of Ukrainians now supporting joining NATO is well over 50%. While I was there in 2006, 2009, it was about 20%. So the Russian invasion of the eastern part of their country and their illegal annexation of Crimea brought it home to Ukrainians how important a good security alliance is. And they figured out that NATO is a good one and they would like to join.
Right. So one of our audience members notes that at the time of German reunification, there was at least a verbal commitment made that Eastern European countries, especially post-Soviet countries, that is, would not join the EU or NATO. Have we essentially decided that's defunct?
That story has been around.
Yeah.
That story has been around. I've heard that story. Many people have heard that story. As your questioner rightly says, it was never written down. It was never part of any agreement that I ever was able to find, and people have looked hard for that. So there was never any formal agreement that said that no Eastern European country would ever join NATO. And let's just be clear, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, fell apart, it was not the NATO alliance that went looking for members. It was the newly freed Poland and the newly freed at the time Czechoslovakia and the newly freed Hungary and the newly freed Baltic states, Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia. These newly freed countries knew what it was like to be under Soviet rule, and they didn't like it. And they were threatened by the Russians. And so they knocked on NATO's door. NATO did not try to pull them in. They knocked on NATO's door, and NATO said, well, there's certain standards you have to meet in order to join this security club. And once you meet those standards, then we'll consider it. And they did. They worked hard, and they reformed their military, they reformed their governments. And they are now, most of them, there are a couple of the Eastern European countries that if we had to do it over again, we might think about it hard, but most of them are doing great. And they're members of the EU and they're members of NATO.
Very good. I'm going to read this last one because it's a big question and it's got a lot of points that might be worth talking about. So important issues that require better geopolitics and positions all over the place. He worked with the UN, NGO, and diplomats on the conservative side, but he didn't support meaningful UN renewal nor soft power. It's still in the books, and the new UN Secretary General is still open to US support for sustainable peace and prosperity, not just US control with so much big power military, but what the United States is doing is leaving so many non-sustainable, sicker and poorer states. Do we need better diplomacy, identity, and interest development, like human rights and mental health, versus where am I going with this? Big power. So don't we all need to leave our children a better world on the ground? Not just some of us. I hope I summarized that well, Robert. I think he's looking at soft power versus hard power. And a couple of the other questions we're asking, maybe tied in. When you talk about we should be doing this, you talked about the institutions that create U.S. foreign policy. Is there a position for NGOs and us lowly folks to influence U.S. foreign policy?
Absolutely. So you're right. There are a couple of elements to that question and that series of questions. So let me do a couple of them. On the last question, absolutely. An important part of that institution, that regular channel, is input from citizens. Input from citizens through their representatives in Congress and the House and Senate. Their influence in elections. Because when they elect a president and they elect who in turn appoints the Secretary of State and Defense and National Security, that's really important, citizen participation. But also, there are organizations all over the country, and you, Angela, are a personification of one such NGO, the whole World Affairs Council. And other similarly interested and focused citizens groups who have views and make those views known in conversations like this. And your representatives in Peoria and representatives and senators across the listen to you, as you know. I mean, this is part of what you do so effectively. So that is a very important part of the regular channel, as is the press, and again, and think tanks. So there are a lot of unofficial, non-government actors who play into it and provide input and good ideas, and new ideas and fresh ideas, which gets to the first part of your question, I think, on the business of hard power, soft power. The United States has been able to lead since World War II because of both hard power and soft power. There's no doubt that part of our ability to lead was because we had a strong military, very strong military. And we were allied and are allied with other countries that have strong military. So there's no doubt that hard power is a component. However, that's not enough. And the reason that in my view, the reason we've succeeded, the United States has succeeded in establishing a regime, an order since World War II. It's kind of liberal international order that we talk about, or the kind of rules-based international order. The reason the United States was able to do that was because we had ideas. We had ideas that nations are sovereign, and nations get to decide for themselves how to govern themselves. I mentioned the sovereignty of Ukraine being able to decide whether or not it joins NATO or goes with the Russians, or whether it decides to join the EU or join a Russian organization. Nations are sovereign, and that idea of sovereignty, of individual rights, of market economies, of open trading, all of those things were good for us. There's no doubt they were good for the United States, but they were also clearly good for the world. And people saw that. And other nations saw that we were willing to defend that order, that international order. And that was soft power. So it's both. And I'm certain, I was in the military. I saw that. That's not the answer. It's not the military is not the answer. For example, in Ukraine, we're not going to kick the Russians out of Donbass. It's the soft power, it's negotiating power, it's the power of alliances and allies that share our values and our views. And Ukraine is one of them.
Good, thanks. I have a question about agriculture. Are you comfortable asking or answering a question about the state of of Ukraine's agriculture, once known as the breadbasket of Europe, of the Soviet Union. How is agriculture doing in Ukraine today?
Agriculture in Ukraine is about to take a major leap forward. Just in the past 2 weeks, Ukrainian parliament has finally decided that it's okay for people to be able to buy and sell land. Now, this doesn't sound very remarkable to us. And it turns out Ukraine was one of only 5 countries in the world where people were not allowed to buy and sell land. And so they didn't like being in that little club. It was a bad club to be in. And so they finally passed it. However, the politics of land reform in Ukraine were tricky. And Ukraine, as you say, and your questioner is absolutely right, that the natural resources that Ukraine has in terms of its black earth is so productive, it's so rich. I mean, I'm not a farmer, but I drove around Ukraine a lot. And I remember, and my family remembers, driving past in the spring, fields that go as far as you could see of black earth, rich, loamy earth, that it's beautiful. I mean, this is dirt, and it is a beautiful dirt. And now that you can buy and sell land, you can also borrow against it. If you own land, you can borrow against it, and then be able to do what farmers all over the world do, in particular in the United States, but all over the world. They borrow for the next season's crops, and seeds, and fertilizer, and equipment, and then it's paid off. They can't do that in Ukraine to any great extent until now. And now they finally have overcome this, frankly, a populist argument that was made over and over and over, year after year after year. That, well, yeah, we want to reform the land so that people can buy and sell it, but just not now. Maybe next year. And over year after year after year, they said, just not now. Next year, then we'll be ready. So Zelensky, again, going back to President Zelensky, that was one of his big reforms. He ran on that, and he delivered. It's still not very popular, I will tell you, because the populists have convinced a lot of Ukrainians that the oligarchs are going to come in and buy up the land, because now you can buy and sell it. The oligarchs you can buy, or the Chinese, or the Russians, or the Americans, or somebody's going to come buy it up. So they're afraid of it, but they nonetheless passed it, and it's a good thing. So Ukrainian agriculture is about to explode, I believe.
Oh, okay, thanks. I'm going to combine a couple more questions here. A few people are asking about the cultural differences between Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine. And I'm going to add, perhaps, have you found that there are cultural differences, perhaps from its history? Western part of Ukraine was still under Polish-Lithuanian authority a lot longer than the eastern side of Ukraine, for example, which might be why they're pro-Russian. But then, if you wouldn't mind taking that into a question of the rise of nationalism. So is that also part of the cultural difference, the religious difference between East and West, the cultural difference between East and West, and how does the rise of nationalism in Ukraine, and how is that reflected in the rest of Eastern Europe as well?
So let me just deal with that last question on the rise of nationalism, which is known in our country, it's known in Eastern Europe, and it's known in Ukraine. It turns out in Ukraine, the far right, the nationalist far right, gets almost no support in elections. They have gangs, and some of these gangs operate with some immunity. Immunity may be too strong, but some of the law enforcement organs in Ukraine look the other way, or will make excuses for some of these gangs. Now, to be fair, some of these militias have been heroic in fighting the Russians, and what the Ukrainians need to do is distinguish between those that are heroic in fighting against the Russians and the crooks and the thieves and the thugs that are that are damaging the reputation of the other. So there's that. They have almost no support in the elections. They get 1% to 2%. The parties that represent that get a couple of percent. Rarely get into the parliament. So it's a problem. It's a problem in East Europe. I will tell you that the Russians exacerbate that problem. The Russians know that that's a weakness of Ukraine. They know it's a weakness in this country, and the Russians exacerbate it here. So that's the first thing. The first part of the question, though, Angela, about the cultural and linguistic and religious diversity of Ukraine is certainly the case. Let me say a couple of things. One is when I was in Ukraine in 2006, 2009, there was real politics. There wasn't fighting. The Russians had not invaded at that time. But there was real politics between East and West. And up until then, and it continued after I left, the presidents were elected from opposite sides of the country. So one president was elected from the West, and then he was followed by a president from the East, and he was followed by a president from the West, and then the East. So they went back, and so those are real politics. That's what's supposed to happen. That was true until 2014. In 2014, when the Russians invaded, again, a lot of Ukrainians who lived in the eastern part of the country, who, as you say, for historical reasons, had family and friends and businesses and criminal ties and religious ties to the Russians. That's fine. And just exactly as you said as well, in the West, there were those historical, religious, cultural ties to Europe, to the Poles, to the Lithuanians, to the Austro-Hungarians. There was that kind of history as well. Ukraine today, like the United States to some degree, is diverse. It's diverse in terms of its people. It's got a lot of different languages. It's got a couple of different religions, mainly Orthodox, but even the Orthodox, it's divided between the kind of the people who will acknowledge a Moscow patriarch. That church is getting smaller and smaller, as you might imagine, and people who acknowledge the Ukrainian, new Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But it's a diverse country, and that's okay. One of the things that President Zelensky has tried to do in both governing and in his speeches, the Independence Day I was there for, he gave a really moving speech, Independence Day on New Year's Day, and the theme of his governing and the theme of his speech is, look, we are all Ukrainians. And that has been more true since 2014 than before, because in 2014, the Russians made it clear where they were. And I've talked to many Ukrainians who said, we used to think the Russians were our brothers. No longer. They're clearly not our brothers. They're killing our brothers. So that has changed. Mr. Putin, by invading Ukraine, has done more to unify Ukraine than any Ukrainian leader in history. And Ukraine is now much more politically unified. He didn't get 73%, but I'm not talking about everybody's totally in support of Mr. Zelensky, but they are overwhelmingly opposed to the Russians encroaching on their sovereignty. So it is a more unified, but it's a very diverse country, and there's strength in that, as we know.
All right, I'm going to ask the last two questions together, and then I'll wrap it up when you're done. So the first one is hopefully a short one. What would you recommend for a news site for people who want to keep up on information from Ukraine?
So the Keypost, English language newspaper, and they could use the help. I mean, all independent media around the world. Subscription is not that expensive, but if you sign up for the Keypost, and I think you'll get the editor is a guy named Brian Bonner, who's a very smart man and committed to Ukraine and wants to see it succeed. So I would recommend the Keypost.
Okay, and I lied. I was supposed to ask both of them at the same time. The other one, of course, we can't let you get away without one question about the impeachment proceedings. And from one of our PAYWAC members, he wants to know if you were on the committee instead of a witness, what would you have done? How would you have voted?
This is not a fair question. This is not a fair question. I went out of my way to avoid that question. I went out of my way to emphasize to the members of the committee that I was not there to make a judgment. I was not, and I told them, that is your job. You have to decide. I was a fact witness. That is, I was there to tell what I knew. I was there to tell people, tell the congressman what I had heard, what people had told me, what I knew to be the truth. I told them that I had no, my opinion is irrelevant. I told them, and I know your questioner says, I know, but if you had to vote, how would you have voted? Yeah, but I'm going to duck. I'm going to duck, Angela. I'm not going to answer that.
That's okay. And I forgot what advice would you give to General Dayton as he takes over as ambassador?
So General Dayton and I have had many conversations already. In fact, when I was there, when I was there last fall, I had actually suggested his name, put his name on a list of candidates, and I was urging him to do this. And he was, he had some questions as to whether or not he was going to go out, because he had this nice job in Germany. And this is a hard job. So my advice to him, and he totally gets this, is that Ukraine's an important place for all the reasons that we talked about earlier in this conversation. It's on the front line. It's important to the United States. If Ukraine succeeds, the United States succeeds, and Ukraine's success is important to our security. So this is an important job, and he gets that. My advice to him was twofold. One, listen to Ukrainians. Listen to people. The ambassador out there needs to listen and then report back to Washington as to what the Ukrainians need, what they think, and what they want, and what mistakes they're making, because they make mistakes. But we're not there. He's not there. The United States is not there to tell the Ukrainians what to do. That's not his job. His job is to work with them, to support them when they need it, to identify areas that the United States, with its soft power and hard power, can support them in their quest to be a normal European country. This is what they really want to do. So that's the first thing. Second thing is take advantage of a great embassy. He's got some great people out there, starting with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians that work in the embassy are the backbone of the U.S. presence out there, and they've been there the whole time, and they know their country, and they're serving their country by working in the U.S. embassy. So so he goes in there with a strong hand, and I think he'll do a great job.
Terrific, thank you. Well, and on behalf of the council system, thank you very much for joining us tonight. So
Angela, thank you.
And I don't know if you can see the little pictures.
I can. Thank you all.
So,
thank you.
And thank you all for attending this C/C Amplified. Remember, it's council to council. Remember to support your local council. There are over 90 of them across the country. You can find one locally to join and be part of this conversation. But for more information about this week's events, go to cxcamplified.com. They've got all kinds of programs all week. And again, Ambassador Taylor, thank you so much for joining us. And I have learned a great deal. So come back on.
It's always a pleasure. It's always
good. Thank you.
I will be back in Peoria.
Sounds good. Everybody come back on Friday for Ambassador Ron Newman on Afghanistan.
Excellent.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.